be advised that this recorded webinar has been edited from its original format, which may have included a product demo. To set up a live demo or to request more information, please complete the form to the right. Or if you are currently not on CSC Global, there is a link to the website in the description of this video. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, ICANN 77, Insights from the Meeting in Washington, D.C. My name is Christy DeMeo-Ziegler, and I will be your moderator. Joining us today is Gretchen Olive. Gretchen is the Vice President of Policy and Strategic Account Management for CSC. For over 2 decades, Gretchen has helped Global 2000 companies devise global domain name, trademark, and online brand protection strategies, and is a leading authority on ICANN. And with that, let's welcome Gretchen.
Thank you, Christy, and thanks everybody for joining us today. As usual, we'll have a lot of information to cover from the latest ICANN meeting. There was, quite a bit that was happening, but before we really dive into all the policy things, we'll spend a few minutes just to kind of do an ICANN overview. I do see a few fresh names on the registration list, which always delights me. So I just want to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page and level set before we get started. So ICANN every year has 3 public meetings. There's a meeting usually in the March timeframe, one in the June timeframe, and one in sort of like October, November. The one in October, November is kind of their annual meeting. It's the largest meeting that they have. A lot of kind of topics of high interest and sort of showcasing some of the work ICANN and the ICANN community has accomplished over the year. This meeting, the one in June, is the policy forum. It is the shortest of the meetings. It's kind of a compressed schedule. And really, it's an opportunity to bring together all the kind of different working teams and really have them focus on the work and sort of getting feedback and input from members of the community as to some of the work product that they've put out. So these 4 days were jam-packed as usual, and lots happening. Here we have a organizational chart of ICANN just to kind of give people a sense of when we talk about ICANN, there's sort of 2 phrases that are used. One is ICANN org, and one is ICANN community. So when you talk about ICANN org, that's really the paid staff, the folks, the CEO and president and the staff who are, paid staff that help facilitate and kind of get the work done of the different teams, the different policy teams and working groups and et cetera. They are kind of the backbone of all that work that gets done. The rest of the chart is the ICANN community. That's all the different stakeholder organizations, the advisory team, advisory committees, and task force. So we focus in this webinar series in that big blue box in the center, the GNSO. That's the Generic Name Supporting Organization. That group is made up of volunteers across registrars, registries, intellectual property interests, business interests, ISPs, non-commercial interests, not-for-profit. So it's a pretty wide, divergent group of interests for sure, but that's usually the group that really a lot of the policy work comes out of. The other group we talk a fair amount about is, you'll see this dark gray box on the bottom right, and that's the Governmental Advisory Committee. So they're made up, that committee is made up of ministers basically from different countries, typically like the telecom ministry is usually where a lot of them come from. And they're really there to advise ICANN in terms of sort of the public interest. And as different policies kind of bubble up from the bottom up in this ICANN multi-stakeholder model, the Governmental Advisory Committee really is there to kind of say, okay, that may sound good, but like, how will that impact the public interest, and sort of give that perspective. So, ICANN is a somewhat complex organization in that it's a consensus policy organization. Consensus is hard fought. There's a lot of very divergent interests in the ICANN community, so it often makes things go at a very slow pace because that consensus is hard to reach. So with that, we should all be level set as to who ICANN is. Let's just also talk a little bit about a transition the organization is going through. At the end of last year, the president and CEO, Gore Marbury, resigned. And so this has now set off an executive search process. For the time being, Sally Costigan, who's one of Gore Marbury's kind of right-hand people, is the interim CEO. And you know, this process kind of got kicked off at the first meeting of the year in February, and since that meeting, the search committee has kind of created a draft job description and a candidate profile. And, you know, I think a lot of us were kind of struck a little bit like, okay, it's been 4 or 5 months. Why are we spending so much time on that? But in fairness, you know, ICANN's, you know, kind of ICANN and the role of the ICANN president CEO has been evolving, certainly as the internet has evolved. So I think they wanted to take that step back and just kind of really get, not just use the old job description, but get the most current and kind of put together what they see as the ideal candidate. It's very disruptive when there's, you know, a lot of churn at this position. So I think they're trying to see if they can get someone who will really stick. The next steps in this process, so by the end of you know, August, September, they expect to contract with a search agency. They should have some candidate identification done by the meeting at the end of the year in Hamburg. And then in December, they should have a kind of a long list of candidates from those applicants. And then they intend to interview at the top of 2024. I can't believe we're already talking about 2024, but the top of 2024, talking about interviewing candidates on the short list. So the process is moving, and we'll see what comes out of it. All right, so if I had to give 2 big themes to this meeting, I would say number 1 was sort of the path to round 2 of ICANN's new gTLD program, and the second was DNS abuse. There's lots of other things being talked about, lots of working committees, but a lot of these tie back to those 2 big kind of themes. So let's first focus on the path to round 2. So let me just do a little bit of history here, because I know that not everybody has been in the domain industry for, you know, 10 plus years. And so this story does go back over 10 years. In 2012, ICANN had the first round of new gTLDs. It was a process that took many, many years before that to kind of get defined and kind of set out. But in the top of 2012 and through May of 2012, ICANN took applications, and, you know, all in line with a process and kind of rules that had been developed for this. But they had taken applications for new gTLDs, new namespace, for, you know, for consideration. And there was really no limit as to the number, kind of predetermined limit to the number of top-level domains or TLDs that would get through successfully through the application process. So what ultimately happened is there were over 1,900 applications, way more than anybody expected. When it all kind of boiled down to over 1,400 unique strings. And, you know, as the process kind of got underway, it was a little bit of a mess. There were hiccups. There were things not contemplated. It was, you know, a long process. And really the first TLD didn't get delegated until very late 2013. And it really was, you know, 2014, 2015, 2016 where you saw the bulk of these new gTLDs that were applied for in that first round kind of start hitting the internet. Believe it or not, there's still some TLDs to launch. There were rules around, you know, when how quickly applicants had to contract with ICANN after getting through the application process, how quickly they had to have their TLD delegated to the root zone. But there was no limit of time, no time kind of, you know, determined end by which they needed to start operating or have launch procedures announced. So we still have some TLDs that, you know, some of them were ones that had a bumpy road. Some of them were ones that were just held back by the applicants themselves. waiting to kind of develop a business plan and kind of dedicate the resources to do it. But now, a lot of the work that's happened since that has been, okay, what did we learn from that first round? Because ICANN promised the Governmental Advisory Committee, you'll remember that little gray box I pointed out on the org chart there. ICANN promised the Governmental Advisory Committee that once sort of round one was over, and even though we have some TLDs still to go, I think people feel like most of them are launched, that there would be kind of analysis on what went right, what went wrong, and then corrective action taken. And so that's been the process we've been kind of swirling in, if you will, or spinning in, really since like 2015, 2016, 2017, a lot of the analysis part and working groups around different parts of the program started. And we are now at a point, again, where we're sort of seeing a convergence of all that work that's been happening really since 2017 forward. Final reports have been issued, and now those kind of things are going through different kind of stages of implementation. So at the end of the last ICANN meeting in February, there was a final report that the ICANN board reviewed and was voting on, and it's called this Subsequent Procedures Working Group's final report. And that group was tasked to look at what was called the applicant guidebook, which is sort of like the manual of how to apply for a TLD, what the process would be in handling those applications, the rules for kind of like them getting delegated and launched. So all that process that happened as a result of the applications being put forth at the beginning of 2012, that applicant guidebook was really what the Subsequent Procedures Working Group focused on in their final report, and it had many recommendations. And ultimately what happened at the end of the last meeting is the ICANN board approved, I think it was 98 of their recommendations. There were 38 that were put in sort of a pending pile, things where they needed a little bit more work, or there were still some questions outstanding that the ICANN board had. And then the ICANN board also in that resolution kind of outlined dependencies to kind of give the community, and this is, again, ICANN org, ICANN community, which is sort of all those groups, and all the people who are, involved as volunteers in ICANN, give the community a sense of what also needed to happen beyond the, we're getting this sub-pro recommendations implemented. What were the other dependencies to get into round two? So that's kind of set in motion a bit of, I think a more clearly defined process, or ICANN staff are definitely trying to kind of outline a more clearly defined process of, okay, what's everything that needs to be done to get to round two? And, I think there are some people, and I'll speak about the brand community. There are some members of the brand community who are very interested in when round two will happen. Part of round one was .brands, where companies applied for their company name or a product name. And there are some brands that are really interested to be able to put forth an application for their organization. There's probably equally or maybe even more in the brand community who are like, I would be happy if there wasn't a round two of ICANN gTLD program. So there's this real sort of pull and tug that's going on across the community. Just about every, if you kind of look at every different type of group, there's some that want it to move forward and they want it now and they want it to happen fast, and they're putting a lot of pressure on ICANN to kind of like get it done. Like, let's get to the point where people can apply again. It's been 11 years since the first program, and ironically, when that happened, even though the ICANN told the GAC that they would do this analysis and corrective action, there was also something in the original guidebook that said, we expect to launch the second round 1 year after the close of the first round. So we're a little off from that. So there's some frustration on some part, but ICANN's trying to give, ICANN and ICANN staff are trying to give a little bit more, I think, of a framework and a little bit more of clarity around like what needs to happen and what timescales that should happen in. So, so right after that resolution was passed at the end of the last meeting, ICANN called to have an implementation review team formed. That's part of the ICANN process whenever they have these types of kind of recommendations that get voted on by the board. There's an implementation review team that's created. It's a mix of ICANN staff and volunteers from the community. They put out the call, and that group has been formed. So now they're working on sort of kind of bucketing, if you will, the work that needs to get done. And what's kind of come out of this is there's 4 work streams. There's kind of seeing 4 work streams that need to be worked and managed to get to round 2. And that's policy implementation, program design, infrastructure development, and operationalization of kind of the program. Now, I will tell you in the first round, there was a lot of focus on the policy implementation part, and probably not as much as needed to be focused on the other 3 pieces. And I think ICANN's trying to learn from that kind of mistake and really make it clear that we can't just have policy without all the sort of underpinnings in place. So I think that's a positive sort of lesson learned. The goal here, though, is to deliver an implementation plan. That doesn't mean the plan is baked and that, you know, like everything, that everything's done and that, you know, it's just going to be a few months to execute on. No, it's going to be probably a pretty big implementation plan. But basically, it would really set out what needs to get to kind of the actual deliverables and tasks and milestones that need to be hit to kind of like move this program towards launch. I think there's a lot of things going on independent to the recommendations of the sub-pro working group, the subsequent procedures working group. There's some policy development processes, PDPs, that are also kind of going on simultaneously. That's always the case at ICANN. There's always like multiple kind of policy initiatives going on at the same time. And so things like there's a PDP right now on IDN, internationalized domain names. There's work being done by a small group on closed generics. There's work being done around, WHOIS. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening and swirling within, the policy side of things that, will have an impact on the timing. So that's a little bit of the variables that are always in the mix. Now, in terms of funding for all this, so ICANN, funded this really through the end of October of this year, gave $9 million to get this work done. They said this is the last of the money from round 1. So they're going to have to find money in the budget for all these things that need to get done. They'll start preparing their budget for fiscal year 24. They kind of a weird budget year. They go July 1 through June 30th. So, they'll be starting to work at the next ICANN meeting, getting prepared for the next, the following budget year, which is sort of like 24, 25. So we'll watch that unfold. There's also been a lot of discussion around building awareness and doing outreach around the new gTLD program, the second round. So in the first round, it was kind of felt after everything kind of got out there, for those who are at ICANN meetings and kind of follow things, they were in the know, they were aware, they had an understanding of what was going on. But the world at large, I think, could be easily argued, did not have an understanding of what was going on. And so what happened is the applications that did come in, a lot were from North America, then followed by EMEA and APAC. There were a small sprinkling from Latin America, and South America. There's a small sprinkling from Africa. There's really a sense that there wasn't the necessary outreach, communication, and support to help people who are not sort of ingrained in this process be able to understand the program and participate, both financially and from an understanding of the process perspective. So there's a lot, it's something that Jack is really, really focused on in ensuring that there is support to build awareness and outreach and, not only when I say support, not only, understanding, but financial support to emerging places where the internet is just sort of, just starting to emerge and really trying to help those areas of the world kind of connect. So, a lot that has to go on there. And then the other kind of thing that was highlighted, which I am happy to see, is really this sort of sense of quarterly reporting. And it's a little bit off of quarterly in that it's at 2 weeks before each ICANN meeting, which there are 3 a year, but sort of this more like frequent, regular cadence of reporting. That's what I'll say, is that there'll be a kind of a scorecard and a progress report that will be issued at least 2 weeks prior to each ICANN meeting, which will be great. Sometimes you're getting documents, documents are getting published, days or the day of kind of arriving at an ICANN meeting. It's hard to absorb all that information. And then there's meetings where you can provide feedback or input or insights. And because you really haven't fully digested the information, it's hard to provide kind of the best input and the best feedback. So glad you're kind of trying to get to that discipline as well. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of the things that are going on. And what ICANN is really trying to do is not have sort of like, okay, we have to do all the policy work first, and then we'll get to program design, and then we'll get to infrastructure development, and then we'll get to operationalization. That's quite a word. They're trying to make sure that it's not sequential, but sort of happening in parallel. And I think that will serve the program really well and the community at large really well, because while it's very hard to do all these things simultaneously, I think the space evolves so much that if you're doing it sort of like in a linear way, what you do at stage one is going to be out of date by the time you get, really end of stage two. So I think it's good to be kind of doing it in this parallel kind of process. So to give you a sense, there were some, kind of just giving you some screenshots here of some of the slides that were presented during the meeting, because I think they did a really nice job of trying to break it down into sort of digestible pieces. Often, I've been involved in this for just about 24 years. There's a lot of acronyms. There's a lot of, process nuances. There's a lot of kind of inside, what they call inside baseball, where, just because you've been around it for so long, you understand it. But it's really hard for people new to this, maybe not been involved, to come and really provide, number one, understand what's going on, and then secondly, provide meaningful input. So it really, I really like seeing this kind of less policy wonk way of describing what needs to get done, and a more sort of like business way of describing what needs to get done, so that everybody, no matter sort of what their level of involvement or their background here, can sort of understand what's going on. So, as I mentioned before, on the policy implementation side, the focus, this IRT that was formed, they're first focusing on the 98 recommendations that were, already board approved. Like, let's get working on that, while those other 38 are kind of going through some additional work, so that, we can at least get done what's been approved. So I think, that makes a lot of sense. And then obviously the board needs to work on the resolving the other 38 pending output, so that's a focus. And then in terms of the timeline, this is where everybody kind of gets their heart in their throat a little bit. There was this kind of phrasing that was used in a few sessions of 2 years plus one. And everybody's like, well, that's 3 years. That's how the math works. But I think what they were trying to say is, like, there's a bunch of work that's going to take 2 years, and then there's other work that's going to take about a year, and we could probably do these in kind of sort of parallel, and so maybe it won't be a full 2 years. A full 3 years. Okay, possible. But I think the sense is that, they're saying they're going to try to really drive to get this all done in 2 years. That would put us in sort of mid to late 2025, right? I definitely think you're talking, 2026, and maybe even a little later, because there's a lot of dependencies. So, we continue to watch this. We continue to really keep a close eye on this stuff. But the policy work is the really messy part. And then in the policy implementation, this is, there's these other things, as I've mentioned, that, still need to get done, like the pending recommendations. We need to kind of get some more information from the DNSO in terms of the applicant support program. There's kind of things around closed generics. This has been an issue that has been around for about 10 years since the first round. And what this issue is about is there were some applicants who were brands who, yes, applied for, their company name, but they may have also applied for some generic words that could be considered kind of category words. So I think the most obvious example is Amazon applying for .books. And the Governmental Advisory Committee, this is sort of where they come in on these issues. They're like, it doesn't seem to make sense. It seems to be against the public interest to let a company kind of own a category so that only Amazon could register in the .books top-level domain, or TLD. And so there's been lots of working groups, and now there's a small team and a lot of back and forth between the GAC and these groups trying to figure out what should the rules be around closed generics. And, this is really where you see that rub between sort of, wanting to be entrepreneurial and really trying to push the limits, and sort of government wanting to kind of pull the reins back and say, look, there's a public interest here that needs to be protected. So that is an ongoing conversation. And then there's also things around, like I mentioned, the internationalized domain names, IBN. There's an expedited policy development process, an EPDP, that's been ongoing about that. That relates to what an IBN is that it's a domain name that's in non-Latin script, so like Arabic and Chinese and Japanese. The internet has to handle those characters differently because they're really images. They're not what's called an ASCII character, which is something the internet technology recognizes and knows how to handle. It knows how to handle IBNs, but there are some things that still kind of are challenging. So the IBN EPP is something to kind of help kind of get that further kind of worked out. There's also things around name collisions. That was another issue in round one, where some companies, their internal kind of like networking team will set up, just think of them as make made up TLDs inside the network. So they'll do things like .home or .file to network things. And when these new gTLDs came out, there was a lot of concern about sort of the official TLDs that are put on the root server system by IANA within ICANN, and them being in conflict or actually, exactly matching some of these made-up TLDs internally. And, there were concerns around, the way the internet would handle that traffic and what confusion it could cause the technology and whether there'd be opportunities for data leaks and things like that. And so obviously in this age of data privacy and, just trying to make sure that bad things are not happening on the internet, there's been some additional studies that's been done around name collisions. And this is an issue that also kind of gets brought up when we start talking about blockchain domain names, right? And, so, if you buy something on a blockchain, which is not on the kind of official root server system, how, what if in the next round there's a corresponding new gTLD on the official root server system. What happens there? The blockchain domains right now aren't really recognized by the major browsers. You have to put a plug-in on your browser to work. So there's concern around that, and that's all being discussed as part of name collision, as well as things around the different kind of work streams of rights protection mechanisms, all those types of things. So a lot of policy implementation dependencies, and I think this is where people can easily see it being 3 years and not 2 years. So, but in terms of the program development piece, which are those 3 other buckets, I think there's a lot of work to do here, but the good news is I think it's being identified, and it's being like, these are the milestones, and this is who's going to handle it, and this is what's going to be done. This, I think, was the piece that was, as I mentioned before, was not as well planned in the first round. So I think this will help kind of create that right foundation for the program. And again, just sort of to talk about the methodology, I think what we're seeing is ICANN really trying to help the community understand that we can't just kind of like do issue of the day. We can't just run from one thing to the next. We've got to have a kind of a process and a framework to work under, and there's sort of like a life cycle for that. And so I think part of this process that they're undergoing right now is trying to get everybody to kind of fall into this methodology, fall into this process, which is a little, I think, less emotional in some cases. Some of these policy discussions for round one, oh goodness, the emotions, and just sort of like people's very, very strong positions, and sometimes it kind of clouds the bigger picture. And so I think that's what they're trying to do, is kind of keep this all, like, there's lots of pieces that have to be worked on. They're all equally important. Let's make sure they're all getting worked on. So a lot of focus, as you can see, on getting to round two. There's things that will be coming online, and kind of we'll start seeing. In fact, one of the things we'll see is around the WHOIS. Around WHOIS, as many know, in May of 2018, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, was enacted. And at that time, leading up to that time, ICANN tried to reconcile its kind of contractual provisions with registrars and registries in terms of collecting personal data for WHOIS records with the GDPR. And there just wasn't enough time to do that. So they kind of undertook a process to kind of allow many parts of the WHOIS record to be redacted. And so that, a lot of people will kind of call that when the WHOIS went dark. And so we saw in late 2018 into 2019, a lot of WHOIS records fields redacted, and that's caused a lot of problems for brand owners, for security investigations, for law enforcement. And there's, one of the things that is sort of swirling around that gTLD program is getting the WHOIS kind of back to a point where if people have legitimate interests, law enforcement, security investigation, brand enforcement, IP protection, that they would be able to get that data. And there's been lots of policy work done. The first kind of policy work that was done resulted in kind of a proposal for a WHOIS system that was extremely expensive and would take a very, very long time and a lot of money to develop. And so it took the community some time, but determined that probably wasn't a workable solution. And so over the last year or so, there's been this effort to figure out, like, how do we put together a quick and dirty, if you will, solution to start testing things and to kind of get enough data to understand how these systems, how this system would be used. And so there was, a proposal to have ICANN build it. Last meeting, the ICANN board authorized them to go ahead and build it. And at the end of this year, we're expecting that system will be built. But the question is, it's at this point voluntary participation by registrars. So ICANN's got a lot of work to do around, building awareness around it, convincing registrars to put the data in there. Certainly registrars like CSC, we want that. We're going to participate. But there's other registrars that, they don't necessarily want to make it easy for you to find some of their registrants. So, we've got a little bit of ways to go on that, but that's going to be, again, one of those other issues that's kind of swirling around this new gTLD program and, may impact some timing. And it all kind of leads to, this other topic, as I mentioned, this other major theme of the meeting, which is DNS abuse. Nobody wants any of these new gTLDs to further ignite the fire that is DNS abuse. And so it's important that we get, some things done. And if you participate in this webinar series, over the last couple of years, you've heard me talk about DNS abuse and kind of this patchwork approach that ICANN has had to date. And honestly, ICANN has felt like, well, it's not only, I think ICANN's position has been like, sort of, it's not only our problem. And I agree with that. This DNS abuse issue is everyone's problem right now. And we all need to do what we can and kind of come together and find solutions. But there are things that ICANN can do. And I think over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussion about things that could happen. But we've gotten to a point which is, it makes me kind of really excited that there's some concrete steps happening. We've come to a point where ICANN has been negotiating with the registrars and the registries of gTLDs. And they've been negotiating some contract provisions because every registrar and every registry has a contract with ICANN. In the case of a registrar, it's called a Registrar Accreditation Agreement. In the case of a registry, it's a registry agreement. And so these contract provisions are pretty standard, especially with the registrar piece of it. It's like one size fits all. ICANN has one contract, one RAA basically, and you have to accept it to be a registrar. So they can get things into contracts. That's really a great way of getting things kind of like put into the workflow across all registrars, and then track that for compliance and take action, enforcement action if necessary. Registries, there's a couple of variations of contracts out there because we have legacy gTLDs and new gTLDs, but nonetheless, if they can get this in the contract for the registries, then that also really, really helps. So they negotiated some language with both groups. It's out for public comment right now. That public comment runs through July 15th. So we'll talk a little bit now about what's in that. So in general, on the registrar side, you're going to see that they're adding to kind of the existing obligations of the Registrar Accreditation Agreement. And what I mean by that is it's kind of clarifying that registrars' abuse contacts are readily accessible. When abuse contacts were created, there was never really a lot of instruction about like where that needs to appear on the website and how conspicuous does that need to be. So there's much more about that now. There's also that the registrar has to provide confirmation of receipt of an abuse report. So there are lots of abuse reports that are made to registrars, and the complainant often doesn't know what happens to that in today's kind of world. They, typically registrars receive those complaints and they forward them to their registrant who has, owns that name. And then they're done. It's done what they're supposed to do. And that obviously hasn't been a good experience for the person who's complaining because they don't know what happens. Like it just, they don't even know if the registrar received it. So this will at least give them acknowledgement of receipt. There's also an actual DNS abuse definition. That's big, and it's there's been a lot of different definitions thrown around. There's not sort of like one universal definition that's accepted. So, for the purposes of these agreements and any advisories that ICANN will issue off the back of these amendments, they've defined DNS abuse, which I think is super helpful. And then I think the biggest change is they've added an obligation to now take mitigation action to stop or disrupt the DNS abuse. So that's where a complaint comes in, and before just sending it to the registrar was kind of enough. Now there's an obligation to take mitigation action. That's going to be a little tricky. I can see a lot coming in on the public comments on that one, but we'll watch that closely. On the registry side, it's kind of a lot of the same, just sort of more tailored to the registry. So, they've got kind of like clarifying kind of how readily accessible that abuse contact information needs to be, confirmation of receipt of an abuse complaint, adding the definition to their base agreement, and then things around they also have, taking action, an obligation to take action, mitigation action to stop or disrupt the DNS abuse, and to also do some additional analysis and reporting required around DNS abuse. So those are kind of like the two kind of big adds for the registry group. So that's out for public comment right now. Just to give you a peek of what the DNS abuse definition is for the purpose of these agreements. They kept it really simple. So DNS abuse means malware, botnet, phishing, farming, and spam when the spam is used as a delivery mechanism for DNS abuse. So I give you a link here. It's from the Security Advisory Council. They have sort of best practices and recommended ways of doing things. And they kind of listed that definition from their documentation 115. So you can take a look at that as well. Now, CSC, one of the things I wanted to just take a minute to mention is, look, policy is always going to be behind technology. I think if I learned anything in my last almost 24 years of doing this is that the policy piece is just, the technologists and the technology and the bad guys are usually way ahead of where the policy is. I just think that is what it is, and I'm not sure that that's going to change a whole lot. So it's good we're making this progress. And again, this is just like one little tiny step, getting these things potentially added to the registry and registrar agreements. But we all have to do what we need to do to protect against DNS abuse. And so there's some things that CSC does to help protect our clients. So what I want to kind of highlight, though, is there's some new things that we've recently released. It feels like we have a press release almost every other week these days. Our product team is doing a great job. But we're an enterprise class registrar, so there's a lot that we do to in terms of policy, procedure, account setup, things like that to really help protect our clients. But there's also products and services, and some of the newer ones that we have is 3D monitoring, subdomain monitoring to help with that dangling DNS problem that a lot of companies are faced with right now. And we also have a new product, the newest one just released, domain casting, where we publish out bad URLs that we find to large browsers, ISPs, other partners in the ecosystem, so that while efforts are going to take down names, efforts are ongoing to take down names, sometimes we can stop through this publication of these URLs to these partners, basically get them blocked while the takedown is happening. So if you want more information about that, we have a poll question at the end of this presentation, or you can just drop your name and contact information into the Q&A, and we'll definitely have somebody get out to you to share that information. But while policy is eking towards some improvements, DNS abuse is something you need to be actively talking about within your organization, and really part of your strategic planning process, because this problem is not going away anytime soon. The pandemic lit it on fire, and it's just been kind of blazing since then. So with our remaining minutes here, I want to spend some time talking about the GAC because a lot going on there. And like I mentioned at the very early part of the session, they are a really important group to watch in the ICANN community. Every meeting, the GAC issues what's called a communique. It used to happen on the last day of the meeting. Now it kind of goes a couple of days past because you'll see in a minute, they've gotten a lot more people involved in this. And so, the communique is really, I use it as my sort of weather barometer for ICANN. It really tells me where the wind is blowing on different issues within the sort of the policy-making process. First of all, let me just sort of explain that the GAC is, got over 190 country or territory members. We've been talking over the last few sessions how their membership and sort of observers increased pretty dramatically during the pandemic. Kind of in another spike kind of happened this year. Since the top of 2023, they've had 57 new participants, and 37 of them are just since the last ICANN meeting at the end of February. So there's over 500 delegates. It's a lot of different opinions and ideas and cultural differences, and it's a really interesting group to watch. And I really, I often say that if you're going to kind of wade into the ICANN world, one of the first things to start to kind of follow regularly and read is the GAC communique, because they're not, they're often telecom ministers, and so they're not steeped in all the intricacies of registries and registrars and this and that. They're policymakers, and they're people thinking, how is this going to affect my country? The rules, the laws, the cultural norms, etc. So they kind of really get to the heart of matters, in my opinion, with their communique. So in the communique, there's a bunch of stuff that they'll talk about what they did during the meeting and kind of some administrative things that are happening within the GAC. But then there's these two sections, the issues of importance and then the consensus, the GAC consensus advice. Those are the two most important parts to read. So we'll run through kind of what the issues of importance were this time. The issues of importance you should look at, like, these are the things that the GAC feels are bubbling up and need more attention, or they've gotten attention and they're commenting on whether they think that kind of the progress is going well, or if not, what they think is going wrong. So it's kind of like their way of publicly, giving a rating, if you will, to some of the things that are being worked on before they get to the end state. So closed generics. We talked a little bit about this a few slides ago. This is an issue the GAC has been tremendously opinionated about. They do not like the idea of brands owning kind of categories. And so we're now at a point where there's a small team working on this issue, trying to find kind of rules of the road that can work for everybody. The GAC is saying, okay, like that we're, trying to work on this again and trying to kind of get to somewhere everybody can agree, but they're still kind of stating this is, just the mere premise of this is a problem. Always interested to hear what they have to say, and I think that the closed generics, we've been talking about it for 10 years, and I hope that we can get to a point where we either decide they just can't be, or that they can exist in some very, very, very limited capacity with very specific rules, because the uncertainty around them is, I think, really hard. I mean, we have some brand customers who did apply for generic worded TLDs, and quite honestly, in the first round, there were no rules against that. It turned out once the applications became public, then there was an issue with it, and that, that's very unfortunate. These companies, took a chance, they invested money, and now they kind of feel like they've been kind of tricked. So, there has to be some middle ground here that can be found. So that work continues. The other thing is around registry voluntary commitments, or what they call public interest commitments. So there were some, there are things that, in general, the GAC feels, registries should commit to do. They should be good stewards in the internet ecosystem, and there should be some voluntary commitments each of these applicants for a top-level domain should commit to. There's also public interest commitments where, especially if the TLD being applied for is a term that is sensitive, meaning that term kind of pertains to maybe a regulated industry or some kind of social issue, where there should be some special rules that the registry should be required to abide by to ensure that bad things don't happen, or that country laws are not somehow, country laws are not kind of gone around. That's probably the best way to say it. So this is something that the GAC is kind of reminding ICANN in this communique of, like, let's not forget to get this on the table and to make sure this happens in this next round, because we don't, as the GAC did not feel in the first round, that those commitments were enforceable. And so they're kind of saying, ICANN, it's one thing to have a commitment, it's another thing to have a commitment that can be enforceable. And they're really putting their kind of like stake in the ground to say, these commitments, you have to make sure that they're enforceable. Then GAC consensus advice for GAC early warnings and new gTLDs. And so this was, we talked a little bit, and we'll talk again in just a few seconds around GAC consensus advice. It's a term of art, it's a defined term in ICANN bylaws, and it has some very specific kind of rules. But GAC early warnings in the gTLDs, that was a process. Once the applications were made public, the GAC, and then the members of the GAC, had a certain period of time to kind of say, hey, we've got concerns about that application or that application or that application. And the way it was kind of laid out in the first round, it was not long enough. The kind of the way things were supposed to happen and the way that they could be monitored and the GAC could identify them, there was a lot of kind of hiccups in that process. And it caused a lot of confusion. It caused a lot of stress for applicants. Applicants, talking to government representatives and, trying to understand why, they were upset about their application. Sometimes it was who was applying. Sometimes it was the string itself. Lots of different reasons. So they're kind of, again, letting ICANN know, like, we got to get this process to be better, and let's make sure we're really clear and all the mechanisms are in place, and let's also make sure, ICANN, that you're following the rules around GAC consensus advice. DNS abuse has been, the last 2 years, easily, I think, on every GAC communique. While ICANN isn't certainly the only place DNS abuse should be, there should be discussion and work done to try to mitigate. They continue to be very, very concerned from a public policy standpoint, public interest standpoint, around DNS abuse and the fact that, more TLDs are going to just sort of likely escalate this problem further. And so they're, again, expressing their concern there. Registration data accuracy has been a long-term kind of issue of importance to the GAC around making sure that data, the WHOIS data, even though it might not all be displayed, but the underlying data is accurate, and what is ICANN doing to make that happen. And then the registry data request service, they're happy that ICANN's moving forward with this sort of like slimmed down, quick and dirty solution that they're hoping to have done by the end of the year. But they're kind of like, let's get that going, let's collect the data, and let's make sure we take a moment once that's available and it's running for a while to really understand what's going on here and is this good, is this bad, are there ways to game the system? And they're particularly concerned about the voluntary nature of participation by registrars at this point, because they're concerned that the registrars won't all participate, and they need to first have an awareness campaign around that, and two, they really would like it to be not voluntary. And then the registration data consensus policy, just getting the registration data, what will be in the WHOIS, out and implemented is a really important thing to the GAC to kind of make sure that the different data protection agencies and ICANN and registrars and registries are all working together properly to make sure that the GDPR is being adhered to. At the same time, there's an ability to do the necessary things online in terms of brand abuse, brand protection, law enforcement, and security investigations. So those are the issues of importance by the GAC. And then lastly, the consensus advice. There's some very specific rules around consensus advice. If something appears in the consensus advice part of the Communique, ICANN has three choices. They can accept the advice and implement it. They can reject it. And then there has to be a rationale as to why they're rejecting. And then there's a process. If the GAC disagrees, there's a process for them to kind of arbitrate that difference. And then they can also ask questions if it's not entirely clear what the GAC is asking for. So in terms of consensus advice, predictability in gTLD applications, they want this process to be less, have less hiccups in this process, for it to be really clear when everything's happening. Again, the registry volunteer commitments and public interest commitments, really important to them. Applicant support, making sure there's not only support in terms of understanding the process and procedures, but also financial support. So they're expecting ICANN is going to provide financial support to some of these emerging economies around the world to be able to enable applications to come forward. Auctions, the GAC has never really liked the whole auction of last resort when there's multiple applicants for a string, and even though you go through all the process and procedures, there's still multiple applicants that stand after all that application evaluation. They have felt that people have gamed the auction process. Some have just put forward applications to hopefully get a big payout at an auction. There's also been private auctions prior to the ICANN auction of last resort, where some of the participants or some of the ones who would be subject to the auction kind of a private auction to whittle down the group, and there's payouts among those groups. And then privacy and proxy services, where ICANN has been really concerned. There was a fully baked policy ready right around the GDPR time and right after, when kind of WHOIS was up in the air, and ICANN put on hold the policy implementation for privacy and proxy services. And the GAC has kind of been banging the table about that. Good news is ICANN has reprioritized that, and it's going to get back on track again, so that they are pleased by that.